Welcome to Tucker Carlson. Today, you don't have to be a science person or a philosopher to understand a basic truth about the human experience, and it's this. If you radically change the basic ways that people live and you do it overnight, there are going to be a lot of consequences. Some of those consequences will be good, others will be bad. Everything in this life is a mixed blessing. Nothing has changed the way that we live more profoundly in the West over the past 20 years than the advent of the so-called smartphone. It's a computer in your pocket. It's your memory. It's an amazing advance in the way that we live, but is there a downside? We've not assessed that at all as a country, as a culture, as a globe. What is the downside exactly of the iPhone? We know there has to be one. And maybe the downside is not simply cultural. Reading has ended. Nobody reads books anymore, but maybe it's physiological. Maybe there are essential problems with the iPhone that we should talk about, but almost nobody does. Dr. Deborah Davis does. She's a professor at the University of Pittsburgh for years. She's now the president of the Environmental Health Trust. And she's thought a lot about the potential downsides of the technology that resides in your pocket and the systems that make it possible. 5G, for example. And we are very happy to have Dr. Deborah Davis join us in the studio today.
It's a pleasure.
Doctor, thanks so much for coming on. I think of you as a voice in the wilderness on this question. I should state at the outset the obvious, which is I'm totally ignorant of the science. I don't understand it, and I never will. But I do understand the way life works, and there's always a downside. And whenever you're told to ignore it, you should be concerned. And you have refused to ignore it. I want to just start to frame this for our audience who may not be familiar with you or your work. Testimony that you gave before the United States Senate in 2009, which is like a long time ago at this point, in which you said the use of cell phones and the radiation that they emit may be really affecting people, particularly young men. Here's part of what you said.
One of the most troubling findings is a series of studies that have been produced in the United States. This is one study that was done opportunistically at a fertility clinic, and in Hungary and other countries, finding reduced sperm count in young men who keep their phones in their pockets, which unfortunately many young men do, even though if you read the advice that's on the iPhone and the BlackBerry, it says keep the phone 1 inch away from your body, actually 0.98 inches in case you want to be precise. But the reality is very few people do that. And lots of young men keep their phones in their pockets, particularly in the summertime. And the Cleveland Clinic published a peer-reviewed study showing reduced sperm count, and that was not the only such study, but only the most recent one.
That was 12 years ago that you said that. And by and large, for most people, the response was to ignore it or not even to know that that was true. What you said is true. Before we get into the specifics of it, describe what you think the psychology is here. How could you say something like that in a Senate hearing and no one cared?
Well, initially people cared. And in fact, I wrote a book in 2010 called Disconnect, The Truth About Cell Phone Radiation. And initially it was rated as a top pick by Newsweek, et cetera. And then it just disappeared. And I think the answer is we're all addicted at this point. Yes. We are, in fact, there's no way you could function if you're in the modern world without a smartphone. That's what's happened. And the warnings that have been there all along have been ignored. Now, part of it, as you know very well, is that when things are complex, it's very easy to make them confusing to the public. And this is a complex issue, technically. There's no question about it. But I've spent enough time now working on it that I feel confident to say that we've got to be careful. Cell phones are two-way microwave radios. Most people don't know that. The reason why this warning for male fertility didn't get more widely known, I think I'd ask you the same question, but I can tell you this. There were times the Cleveland Clinic and the Mayo Clinic warned all men coming in who had fertility problems, get the phone off your body, out of your pocket. And that's still the advice at most fertility clinics, but it hasn't gone more public, I think for two reasons. One is we're, as a society, kind of embarrassed to talk about male fertility.
Yes.
It's a huge problem.
Oh, well, it's now endemic. By the way, I should just say, in the years since you gave that testimony, the problems that you predict have become far more widespread. You know, it's a huge problem. It
is. Now, of course, I don't tell you that cell phones are the sole cause of male fertility. There are other causes, could be some pesticides and solvents, endocrine disruptors, which are found in plastics and things. All of these things are relevant. But in the issue of cell phone radiation, we've been in denial. And the denial is in large part, as you said at your introduction, psychological. We simply can't think about the possibility. Is it a chance that these things are harmful? The answer is we have controlled studies where they take a test tube of sperm from a healthy man and they make 2 test tubes. One, they don't expose to cell phone radiation. The other gets exposed. The exposed test tube, those sperm will die 3 times faster with 3 times more damage to their DNA. That has been replicated in many studies, which is how science works. You have to just keep repeating the results. So we know that this is a fact. And yet, when the bodies that advise the government are asked for their advice, they say, we don't have enough evidence. Well, if you look carefully at the membership of those bodies and the revolving door that takes place between the industry and those who regulate it, you can see that there's really not been a full independent evaluation, which is why we at Environmental Health Trust are calling for a full independent evaluation of the science. This is just the past 2 years right here of the main studies done. Will be submitted to the court very recently. And the FCC has utterly failed to look at the science. It's a highly inconvenient truth.
You know, where are the trial lawyers in this? I mean, I have to ask, because greed is non-ideological. It's a great motivator. Trial lawyers are greedy by definition, fine. They ended the tobacco industry effectively by suing. We learned in 1964 officially that smoking causes lung cancer and emphysema, all these health effects. And then they moved in and they shut it down. Why hasn't that happened here?
Well, it's interesting. Some of the same characters that were involved in telling you that tobacco was good for you. Remember, Thank You for Smoking? Very well. It's a brilliant movie and very important basic idea that was the industry had its own PR people whose job it was to tell people smoking, alcohol, and tobacco, it's not really so bad for you.
Yeah, or it's complicated. We're not really sure. The science is out.
In fact, the closing scene of that movie is just precious. It has the guy very confused looking, and off camera it says, well, is it true? Do cell phones cause cancer? And they all speak at the same time. Well, we're not sure, maybe. And then the voice of authority says, I want you to practice saying these words in front of the mirror. While we are concerned about the evidence, at this time we have no proof that that cell phones are causing brain cancer. Yeah. That's the last line of that movie. We have no proof. So what is proof? Proof in science on this issue comes from 2 things. You study animals experimentally under controlled conditions, or you look at patterns in people. And the difference between these 2 fields, which I happen to be both a toxicologist studying animals experimentally and an epidemiologist looking for patterns in people, the epidemiologist can only tell you about the past. We have to wait for the bodies. We are body counters in epidemiology. Yes. The toxicologists try to predict the future. They try to predict what's going to happen. So here we have a whole body of animal studies, many of which are in this stack, many of which have been before the FCC in previous iterations. And that body of studies has been basically ignored and dismissed by the same effort and by the same characters that went around discrediting people who warned about the dangers of tobacco. They have effectively used the strategy of attack the scientists, attack the science, attack the funders, and try to discredit the entire enterprise. That has worked. It worked for tobacco. That's why it wasn't until the 1990s that we finally started to take serious action on tobacco in the environments of children. I was at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences for 10 years, where we did the first studies to say, stop smoking on airplanes. And that was, at that point, that was like a radical thing for scientists to say. It took us 1 year to write the report and about 3.5 years to get it released.
Interesting.
Yes, indeed.
And certainly Apple is far more powerful than Brown and Williamson.
I think so. And I think it's interesting because Steve Jobs and Bill Gates would not let their children have the devices that they sell to billions of people. Not until, in the case of Gates, the kids couldn't have phones till they were 14. Yeah. I actually think that's good advice, but now those of us who have older children, it's too late. But the good news is, from experimental studies that my colleagues and I have done, you can reduce the damage from radiation from the things that we know about. Eating a lot of fish that's not polluted, and eating a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, and some of the products that sometimes come on your show as well, the antioxidants. Right. All of those actually repair the damage, the most important thing of which is melatonin. Melatonin is a natural hormone that you produce at night by sleeping in the dark. you want to make sure your bedroom is totally dark. Blue lights are particularly dangerous in the bedroom. Ideally, you don't want to be on your device an hour or two before you go to bed. And why we know melatonin is so incredibly important is from studies done with blind women. Blind women are naturally in the dark. According to Swedish studies, they have half the risk of breast cancer compared to sighted women.
Seriously?
Yes. And women who work at night, light at night, will prevent you from developing as much melatonin as you would naturally. They also have increased risks of breast cancer. So that light at night is considered a proven human carcinogen by the World Health Organization.
You know, it makes sense. It's completely unnatural. For millions of years, people didn't have it.
Right.
And so what happens when you introduce it? So let's just get back to the core question, which, it's my flaw as an interviewer that I didn't ask you this first thing. What is the amount of radiation emitted by an iPhone? Mm-hmm. And is it rising? Is it falling? What do we know about it?
Well, it's complicated.
Yes.
Okay? The amount of radiation you're exposed to depends on how close you keep the device to your body.
Okay.
That's what it depends on. And if the signal is weak, as you know, your battery will drain out faster. So when the signal's weak, the phone is smart and it's working harder to connect to the tower.
Okay.
That's what that means. So you never want to keep the phone on your body or try to use it when the signal's weak unless it's really an emergency. That's the first thing.
Interesting.
When you have the strongest
because
reception,
it's emitting more radiation.
That's right. And think about it this way. The battery of the phone is draining right into you. That's what's going on. So phone radiation is a complicated thing. The state of California did a study that it finally got released 9 or 10 years later, in which they showed convincingly that the where you used your phone and how much strength you had of the signal made a big difference in the radiation you would get. I'm also concerned about the wireless radiation children get from devices that they are using now in increasing numbers, particularly with the pandemic. I mean, there's no question you want your kids to be digital citizens and know what to do. There's not a debate about that. But the idea that they will learn as well if they are glued to a screen is really being questioned by a lot of early childhood
yeah, or
experts.
Any sane person, I mean, will tell you that clearly not a substitute for human interaction.
No, and the eye contact and having direct experience and touching and feeling things. But the pandemic made it very difficult. And there's also no question that some children did very well learning with the computer system. They did. But however, unfortunately, we talk about a digital divide, and it's real. It's a big deal. Poorer children do not have as much access to the technology, to the hardware, and to the ability to use it. We've all heard stories about families driving to a parking lot so the kid could get access to Wi-Fi to do their homework during the pandemic. That was real. And so we have to recognize that there are real constraints. At the same time, the most important thing I can tell people is distance is your friend. The further away you can keep a wireless device from your body, the better off you are. And wired is always better than wireless. And I have some things we can show you later that with plugs that actually allow you can wire your MacBook, you can wire your iPhone for most things, except not for voice. And wherever possible, we recommend wired, and so does the New Hampshire Commission on this.
May I ask, is there a difference in risk between using your iPhone on cellular or using it on Wi-Fi?
You know, the most important difference is the strength of the signal.
Okay.
Okay? And it's preferable to use it on Wi-Fi if the signal is strong and close, rather than on the internet.
The tower.
Right,
okay.
The tower. But all things being said, the most important thing to do is to get wired connections. And there have been several authorities that have made recommendations about how to do this in schools. And there are some schools that are doing this now, encouraged by state recommendations from the state of Maryland, the state of New Hampshire.
Because cell phones are ubiquitous and they are an integral part of people's lives, every hour of the day, people are checking their cell phones. This is not a small thing.
No.
At all.
No.
This is not like if you go to the Amazon basin, you could get malaria. This is like something you're dealing with every single day, every hour of every single day. So why am I hearing this from you but not from Apple?
Well, money talks, and there's a heavy influence of funding. For example, In the 1990s, the US EPA had a small but very important research program on this issue funded by the Congress. And as soon as they started to produce results indicating that cell phone radiation might damage DNA and other things, the funding was cut by Congress on both sides. So this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. This is a truly nonpartisan issue.
Might damage DNA?
Yes.
Can you explain
Yeah, I
that a
certainly
little bit?
can. Henry Lai and Vijay Singh were two very brilliant scientists at the University of Washington. Lai is still alive. And what they did was to take a living rat and expose it under controlled conditions to what we would now call cell phone radiation. They did this in 1994, before phones were widespread at all.
Yes.
And what they reported was that when you looked inside the brain of these rats and you made a slide of the DNA in the brain, which you could do with a unique test that they developed called the Comet assay, you could see the unraveling of the DNA. They found clear evidence that cell phone radiation at levels then used could unravel the DNA in the rat brain. So what industry response was...
Sorry, that's just awful.
I think so, yes. And
Yeah.
they were very... What industry did was they first tried to get them defunded. They then went to the journal that accepted the article for publication and tried to get it unaccepted. And finally, they went to NIH and accused them of scientific fraud, which, as you can imagine, for a scientist is like usually career ending.
Yes.
Well, the only problem was they were correct on the science. And now, by the way, fast forward almost 30 years later, and there's a study that was done by the U.S. National Toxicology Program. I believe you referred to it in your previous program. And that study found, after $30 million of research, clear evidence of cancer and evidence of DNA damage in rats and mice in multiple organs. You would think that that should be setting off alarm bells. But in fact, what happened is the industry has mounted a very successful campaign using the same PR agencies that they used against the tobacco people, and they have claimed the science is wrong. And, well, yes, there is this national government study that finds a problem, but by the way, it's not really relevant to humans. But guess what? The FDA requested that study in 1999 because they said at the time they were concerned about growing exposure. It wasn't until 2009, when we held a national conference in D.C. on this issue, that the National Toxicology Program reported the beginnings of their study. And it wasn't really until 2018 that they released the results of their study, which they had had several years before. Now, I was on the board of scientific counselors for the National Toxicology Program. I can tell you that in my entire experience with that program, there has never been a single agent that they've reviewed that was subject to this extraordinary peer review. They reviewed it first internally, then they reviewed it externally. And you have to understand, this review is something that would drive most people mad. You blind the data. You don't know what is exposed and what isn't. You have statisticians, pathologists. And after that was done, they then called for yet another review where they brought in a lot of industry toxicologists. And guess what? They said, oh, the study here is even stronger than you think. There is clear evidence. And we think that this should be taken very seriously. And these were toxicologists from Procter & Gamble and Mobil. So that review meant that they had to release a report, and which they finally did. And then what happened, which was, I have never seen anything like this, is that the same agency that originally requested the study in 1999, the FDA, decided that the study design that they had reviewed, that they had approved, that they had gone back and looked at again, was somehow no longer valid, and that the exposure methods that were used, that were developed by Swiss engineers from the Swiss National Institute that pioneers in exposure of radio frequency radiation, microwave radiation from phones, that study was now not relevant to humans.
That's crazy. So why, I mean, this would seem, by its very definition, since it's the entire population, of massive public health importance. So are our public health agencies, if they say that study was flawed, why aren't there 100 more studies?
First of all, they're expensive. All right, this is a $30 million
No, but
study.
everybody, $30 million. We just spent $2 trillion on infrastructure. I mean,
Yeah.
Everybody has one.
Well, that's a very good point, because the infrastructure bill includes billions for broadband, which we need to close the digital divide. But there's no way in hell we're going to close the digital divide by making 5G accessible to everybody.
Okay, so that's it. I want to get into that in just one second, but I've got two further questions for you. So it doesn't sound like we're doing 100 new studies on microwave radiation.
On the contrary.
Okay.
We have, as far as I know, there are almost no new studies underway, and there's no funding because the Congress, in its infinite wisdom, isn't funding this. But you have to understand, Congress doesn't understand this issue.
No, of course not.
It is truly complicated, and complexity does become kind of like a cross to the vampire. It's complicated. Well, we must trust you. It must be okay. And besides which, it's too late.
But here's what we know. We didn't have these when I was a kid. Now they define American life. Any thoughtful society would pause and ask, what's the downside? So that it's kind of that simple from a non-scientist perspective. Like, well, why don't we know more about this? So let me ask you this. Here's one measure. Have we seen an absolute increase measurable in certain kinds of cancer since these became?
Well, let's take a moment. As a cancer epidemiologist, what I have to tell you is it takes a long time for cancers to form in the population.
For sure. Yeah.
20, 30, 40 years. So the type of cancer that we're concerned about are two relatively rare cancers. One is a glioblastoma of the brain, a terrible disease, and we all know people who've succumbed to it. And the other is
not curable, I don't think.
Generally not curable, although I have a dear friend, Alan Marks, who's managed to be alive for 11 years and is just extraordinary and really extraordinary. But he is the exception, and for many people, they're dead within a year. It's certainly true. But the other tumor is an acoustic neuroma, which is a tumor of the hearing nerve. Acoustic, your hearing. Okay, and that involves a thickening of cells around that nerve. And it isn't typically called a cancer, okay, but because it's located very close to the brain, it is considered a very dangerous cancer as it grows. And what happens with this is we have studies in humans clearly showing an increased risk for people who use cell phones for a longer period of time, and those who start to use cell phones, say, as children, have an even higher risk, according to Swedish studies. Now, the interesting thing about the two tumors, the brain tumor and the acoustic neuroma, is that those same rare cancers are showing up in humans in studies that have been done in the animals in the National Toxicology Program study. So the good news is these are rare cancers, okay? But the bad news is these are terrible cancers, terrible diseases.
Yes.
And that's something that we have not addressed because they are rare. So it's not that we're seeing, a quadrupling of brain cancers, nor should we expect a quadrupling of brain cancer. There are 200 different types of brain cancer. So you can very easily slice and dice the data, and I know that because that's what I do, and you can make the increase disappear. But if you look at younger people, the CDC has reported an increase in very rare cancers, including a 4-fold increase in rectal cancer in people under the age of 40 in the United States.
4-fold?
Since 2010. Now, that's a big, okay? The problem is, we can play with numbers, it goes from something like 0.4 per 100,000 to 1.6 per 100,000. You understand? But it's a 4-fold increase. That's a big increase in 1 decade. And we see young people with tight clothes and the things stuffed in their back pocket or in the bra. And we at Environmental Health Trust have a lot of information about why you shouldn't do that. But it's increasingly the case that people are being exposed. I don't know of another explanation for this. It is a rare cancer that has quadrupled in young people.
Well, so that right there is I can't even, I know nothing beyond what you just told me, but just the 4-fold increase itself.
Yeah, right. What are you going to, a trend is simply a trend. We can't tell you what causes it. But we can also point out to a recent study at Yale University that was sponsored by the American Cancer Society. And what that study found was that people with a certain type of genetic mutation had a very much higher risk of developing thyroid cancer from using their phones.
Yes.
The thyroid being located here, of course.
Thyroid famously being the organ that tends to get cancerous because of radiation. Like after Chernobyl, massive increase in thyroid cancer.
Well done, sir.
Well, I don't know much, but I do know that.
Well, actually, and about Chernobyl, it was more increased in children, which was really unusual because thyroid cancer doesn't normally affect children in the same way. And it was really extraordinary. So when something like that happens, we call it a sentinel event.
Sentinel?
Sentinel, like it's a signal. Wake up.
Yes.
Right?
Oh, sentinel, of course, right.
Okay.
The alarm goes off.
So,
Yeah.
for example, mesothelioma and asbestos, it's thought to be almost a unique tumor associated with asbestos. And for when you see thyroid cancer in young people, usually thyroid cancer occurs in older people.
Right.
It's a warning that something else is going on. So it may be a sentinel indicator. But we have to be careful. My colleagues and I have published a paper on this increase in rectal cancer, and we say we speculate, because that's all we can do, what's causing this. And what we think is you have to look at CT scans because they are massive amounts of radiation. But the increase is so large. And by the way, we found the same increase in Iran in this paper we reported on. Since we published this paper, we have seen evidence of increases in the UK and Brazil, again, in younger adults.
Huh. So is there, I'm just throwing this out there because I've certainly noticed, just anecdotally, a big increase in pancreatic cancer. If you live in this country, 30 years ago, how many people had pancreatic cancer? It was a rare cancer,
right.
A very dangerous cancer. A lot of people seem to have pancreatic cancer. I've just noticed, very noticeable. Is there any hint of a connection?
Not that I know of, but those are the kinds of questions that if we need to explore. And what we need is a massive research program.
Have you noticed that, the pancreatic cancer?
Pancreatic as well as liver.
Yes.
The liver may be associated with hepatitis.
Sure.
Okay. And also we know liver is associated with alcohol.
Oh, big time.
Pancreas is a bit of an enigma. But I think we could fund a major program by a penny a month fee on every wireless device and every provider and every manufacturer in order to create the funding that we need to do the research, to monitor. We have no monitoring and surveillance. Do you know the United States testing? No. The United States testing program for cell phones consists of this. The manufacturer gives you one phone, they pick it, then it's tested in a system that's 25 years old, that is based on a 220-pound guy with a 12-pound head. Now you tell me how many people there are in this country, although we are increasingly obese, that of that size and scale, and it's asking one question: how long does it take for that guy's brain to heat up?
That's the whole test?
And he doesn't like to talk a lot. It's a 6-minute phone call.
What about earbuds?
Well, earbuds that are wired are fine, but not the AirPod.
Rather, the AirPod, the new Apple, is very unattractive, suddenly everywhere thing with the little spike that comes out of your head. Are those also emitters of radiation?
Yes. Okay, but not as much. And if your job really necessitates it, only turn them on when you need them, which of course it's a challenge. Here's what we really need. We need the equivalent of airbags and seatbelts for the phones. Just like in the 60s and 70s, people warned about the dangers in cars and the need for protection of cars.
Yeah.
There are changes in hardware and software that can be made. One of our close advisors to Environmental Health Trust is a guy named Frank Clegg. He's the former president of Microsoft North America and Canada.
Huh.
He is now convinced that this industry can do better, but he says you have to force us. That is where it's a delicate balance.
So is there some sort, so let's say you carry, as I do, your cell phone in your pocket. Is there some sort of, just throwing this out there, lead-lined sleeve or something that might be helpful?
Actually, there are companies that make protective things, and it's not lead, it's just any kind of metal that's mesh. And there are companies that make cases that reduce radiation. I have not tested what else they do. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have a case protecting you in your pocket, and you have your phone here, and you have it facing so that the screen is facing you, which is always better. You may be protected from the radiation, right? But the baby that's in your lap will be getting more of it. Do you understand?
I do.
You think about that. So it's a complicated issue, and what we really need is the best and brightest engineers to use the patents that already exist to design phones so that they go to sleep as soon as they're next to the body, which they can do, so that they wake up when they need to, so that routers, which are draining energy and electricity all around the world, go to sleep when they're not used. Think about that. It's just a software thing that could be done. And I've talked to the engineers who...
Seems pretty obvious, right?
Doesn't it? Yeah. But, why isn't it happening? It's a combination of inertia, ignorance, and frankly, the addiction of our age to these devices. So we don't want to bother to think about this. But we are calling for a National Academy of Sciences committee to take a serious, hard look at this is the kind of evidence. I mean, come on. We just submitted this to the FCC, requesting them to look at the record and open their record since the end of 2019. There's more than 75 scientific studies here, studies on wildlife, studies on honeybees. I mean, come on, without honeybees, without the 2,000 pollinating insects.
Right, there's no agriculture.
Forget it.
Right.
Right?
No, that's right.
Yeah.
So now to 5G. This is a big change, 5G. Most people who are semi-paying attention like me think it's a big deal but don't really know what it is. Can you just give us the overview? What is 5G?
It is a big deal.
Yes, okay, so what is it?
It's a marketing scam.
Okay.
To be quite frank.
Okay.
All right? To be quite frank,
no, I love it.
when you look through what it is, okay, first of all, and this part I really admire about the engineers, it's incredible chutzpah. They're going to build it and then figure it out. That's literally what's going on with 5G.
There's an upgrade in wireless. That's basically what they're saying it is.
The way it's being conceived, it's an upgrade in wireless, okay? But what it is simply we had 2G, 3G, and 4G. So it's the next latest and greatest thing that anticipates having 50 billion devices that will all be connected by the Internet of Things. Now, the reality is we do need faster connectivity. And the people that need it the most, quite frankly, are the military and industry.
Right.
And that's where it belongs. And it can be done. And that, in fact, they have made some use of it that's been quite impressive. Where it's not needed is in your bedroom. And the current proposal that is this Congress is to make it legal to allow a 5G antenna to be located anywhere the industry decides it needs to be, with no objection possible. Yes, and that's actually being fought right now.
So like on a power pole right outside your house.
Exactly. And by the way, 30 feet off the ground. And by the way, 30 feet off the ground means, think about where the cell towers are. They're up high, which is good because that's far away from you.
Right.
But if you bring them down low to where you are, then there's a penumbra of the radiation, which will invariably get closer to people. And more importantly, the 5G radiation actually doesn't travel as far. So the argument is, well, it's weaker, and therefore it's going to be safer. Well, unfortunately, there's the downside of that is that while it doesn't travel as far, it also doesn't travel through trees or buildings. So you need to have a 5G antenna located every couple hundred of feet, anywhere you want the system to work. It's ideally suited, as the industry says in all of their submissions, to a dense urban environment.
Sure.
Okay?
So Manhattan's a good place for it.
That is where there are, in fact, a group of people who are organizing now about the new super 5G antennas that are scheduled to go up in Manhattan. And people are figuring out this may not be a good idea.
So if you're going to do that over an entire continent, I mean, that's a lot of antennas.
Estimated in the United States alone to be 800,000 and several million for the world. Yes.
Okay, so if there is a negative health effect of doing that, you probably want to know ahead of time.
Well, here's the problem. The negative health effects we're concerned about, like male fertility, or headache, or neurological disease, or, for example, in teenagers who use phones the most, they have memory problems with spatial memory. These problems are common. And how do you separate out the cause of problems of memory control in children with the physiological impact of the devices, the psychological impact of the devices, and other things in the lives of children nowadays?
Yes.
You understand. It's like a huge simultaneous equation with so many variables.
But if you look around, the percentage of Americans suffering with chronic health problems in 2021 is many multiples of the number suffering from those in, say, 1990.
Correct.
There are all kinds of maladies that are increasing in frequency to the point where you're like, well, there's an environmental cause here. There has to be. So I'm just mesmerized by the inaction in the face of this evidence. It doesn't mean that we understand what's going on, but we know that there's a problem. And no one seems to be taking it seriously. Why are you doing this, by the way? How has this fallen to you?
Well, about 17 years ago, my first grandchild was born, and at 9 months of age, he could crawl over, find a phone that was turned off, turn it on, and play Brick Breaker. He's now a quite accomplished pianist at the Interlochen Arts Academy, performing at Carnegie Hall, etc. The kid is really amazing. But when I first saw that he could do this, and he was enthralled with the device and all the fast-moving colors on it, I began to look into the issue, and I had been on the CDC Lead Advisory Committee. And I knew that the developing brain, with its faster-growing cells, was exquisitely sensitive to environmental pollutants, and particularly lead in the first 2 years of life.
Right.
The earlier in life a child is exposed to lead, the worse it is.
This was a national scandal that people seem to have kind of forgotten about, but having to do with lead paint chips.
I know, and we have to rediscover it, as we just did with the water problems in Flint and other places. It's still with us, unfortunately. It's in the infrastructure bill to finally get rid of lead in more in the urban environment. It's in the infrastructure bill. So I had worked to advise the CDC with other experts on how to reduce lead and what levels should be considered safe for children in 1978. So here I had my first grandchild. It's just amazing, and I knew that his skull was thinner, contained more fluid, and that's where you protect children. You give them bike helmets, ski helmets. First, I was very proud, because it obviously indicated this is a highly intelligent little boy. Then I began to look at the research, and the more I looked, the more concerned I became. There was something, there was a commission by the Stewart Commission for the Royal College of Physicians in England, and I knew Sir William Stewart. I don't know if he's still with us. And I knew him because we'd worked together on decontaminating chemical weapons at the National Academy of Sciences. That was part of what I worked on for the Department of Defense. So I knew him to be a pretty straight shooter. And I found this report from 2000 where he had said children under the age of 16 shouldn't use these devices. And I thought, you know, the British are kind of eccentric, maybe. But then I read what he had to say, and I started to do research, and I found the studies of Henry Lai and Vijay Singh. I found work done outside of the United States for the most part, in France, by people supported by industry, but still saying, looking like this is biologically important. So that's how I kind of got started, because I wanted to protect my grandchildren, and I now have 5 of them, and I'm glad that their parents are aware of what they need to do, but they can't avoid exposures at this point.
No, they can't.
You know, it's
just interesting. So you've had this long career doing a lot of different things. You have grandchildren. Most people be like, you know, it's time to go skiing more or whatever. But so you were that rattled by what you saw.
I felt that I was looking at the most important public health threat the world faced today that there was no discussion about.
Yes.
Remember, I was involved in the report recommended getting rid of smoking on airplanes when that was a really radical thing.
Yeah, okay? I remember.
And I saw how difficult it was. We looked at the science, we wrote the report, and then we waited for the review to be complete, because there was so much pressure on the National Academy of Sciences not to release that report. Really, it was a real interesting introduction to the politics of science.
Yes.
And I was at the front ranks seeing this happen. I think that that's what's happening on this issue. But I am not a voice in the wilderness. I'm proud to tell you that. There are more than 400 scientists who have written to the United Nations urging action be taken to reduce exposures. And recently, several governments have stepped up, not the United States, to urge that phones be tested not with a spacer like they are in the United States.
With a spacer?
A spacer. That's why they say you can hold the phone next to your head, because the model that we use, which is a big empty plastic bowling ball that we put liquid into, a homogeneous liquid, that's our model. And we see how long it takes for that liquid to heat up. That model considers the ear to be the same thing as the foot and the hand.
It's so stupid. So if our viewers are interested in learning more about this, and I think a lot of people kind of probably don't want to hear it because it's just, these are too integrated into our lives. Like, people just don't want to know, you know?
Yeah.
But for those who do want to know, what is a reliable source of information on this risk and what you can do about it?
Well, if they read French, they can go to the French government, because they actually have recommended that they take action on that. And if they look at our website, we have safety cards with information that tell you exactly what you need to know, particularly to protect children. And we are a resource that is highly regarded by most people who are looking into this issue. That's why we exist. We exist to provide clear, understandable information about the serious health risks that are posed by cell phones and other forms of wireless radiation. And we are really encouraged by the growing numbers of scientists in many countries that have stepped up to join us in this effort. Brazil, Portugal, France, Israel, and Belgium. In Belgium, you cannot design a phone to be sold to little kids.
Good.
It's against the law, okay? I believe Taiwan has something quite strict about that as well. And so a number of countries which have more independent scientists. But look, I don't fault the Congress for this. They've been sold a bill of goods by the industry, and it's been a very effective.
Well, it's not just the industry, it's the industry in the country. I mean, Apple's the biggest company in the world by market cap. So you're, I'm struck by your sincerity and your seriousness and your knowledge and the fact you clearly don't need to be doing this, but you're doing it anyway. I have to ask, if the other side of the debate is the biggest company in the world, who's funding you? I mean, you're not getting money from Apple, obviously, to do this, are you?
Well, I could start with my husband, but not. No, we are funded by donations from small people, and we have a few private donors that give us some funding as well. And we don't get any money from industry. And I'm encouraged by the fact that more and more people are supporting us. That's what we need for support. You know, we can't do this without funding. But we also have a very, very slim operation. We were virtual before it was fashionable.
Good for you.
Okay? So we have an office in Jackson that happens to be my house. And we have an office in the D.C. area that happens to be someone else's home. And we are managing with that. But we have excellent colleagues around the world, in and out of governments in other countries, that are working with us. And we have people in the United States who have worked with industry for years that are giving us information. And right now, there are a couple whistleblowers in the wings. They're not quite ready to go out, but we are getting there. Good. So let me just say this. When Steve Jobs was alive, there was a company in Israel called Talk-On, T-A-W-K-O-N. And I was involved in trying to help them market their product because I thought it was a great idea. What it is a device, software into your phone, an app that flashes green, yellow, or red, depending on the amount of radiation your phone is putting out into you.
Oh, I love that.
Okay, it's a 10-year-old app. It could have been done like that. Steve Jobs was given a chance for this and wrote 2 words back: not interested. 6 months later, he was dead. Now, I think what killed Steve Jobs was a combination of his exposure to chemicals as a 12-year-old working on the Hewlett-Packard production line, and his constant keeping of cell phones right next to his body. Yeah. And we can't separate out. This is a good example of the problem you asked me earlier. We can't separate out for one individual like Jobs what caused his very rare cancer, which was a rare cancer. And I'm telling you that we know that a number of the chemicals that you need to use in producing a masterboard and the things he was working on, that he worked with as a kid, are carcinogens, and so is all this cell phone radiation. And studies have found that if you combine cell phone radiation with lead or with another known cancer-causing agent in animals, you get triple to quadruple the number of tumors. So that is why I think that where we are is, yes, I was a lone voice in the wilderness, but remember, who wrote the foreword to my book? David Servan Schreiber, New York Times bestseller of millions of copies of books, Anti-Cancer. He wrote in that preface that we are all enthralled with the toys of our age and none of us wants to think it might cause our demise. 2 years later, he was dead of a brain cancer.
At what age?
50.
Too young.
Way too young. Way too young.
I'm really struck by how, to be blunt, how non-crackpot all of this is. So typically you a consensus in a society and everybody thinks one thing or refuses to think about something, and someone comes along and says, no, actually, you should all rethink the consensus, that person tends to be a little crazy. You are clearly not crazy at all. You're a super scientist, and I think what you're saying is incredibly important, and I really hope a lot of people will hear it.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, it's totally heartfelt. Again, I'm coming in from a place of complete ignorance, but common sense suggests that your perspective needs to be taken very seriously.
And I'm not anti-industry.
You're clearly not.
I'm just pro-health. And I think we need to figure out how to protect our health, particularly that of our children, but for all of us. And the thing I know from Frank Clegg of Microsoft is that industry already holds patents on how to do this in many cases. And what you said about the trial lawyers is precisely the problem. Because once the first industry steps up and says, hey, here's our safer phone, then the lawsuits just come everywhere.
That's right.
So I have another idea for how to get rid of that, but industry and the lawyers aren't going to like it. I think we should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on toxic hazards, which would include chemicals and radiation.
Yeah.
And we should say, okay, you come in the next 2 years and you provide all the data that you have on your workers and every other exposure, and we will then limit your liability.
Indemnify you, yeah.
To just indemnify the costs. Now, that wouldn't be popular with anybody, but I think it might be something to take very seriously.
If you take people's health seriously, and it's gotten to the point where if you look at the numbers, of people suffering from chronic, incredibly expensive, debilitating conditions in this country, it bears no resemblance to the country we grew up in, like none.
I'm afraid you're right, but I think that's why it's so important that this conversation we're having take place, because you reach a different audience than the one I normally reach. I am not political on this issue. I just want the truth to come out because
That's how I feel. I don't think this is political. I don't think this is political at all.
It should not be.
No, amen. Dr. Deborah Davis, recommend to our viewers, if you're interested, look more deeply into this because it feels like it really matters. Appreciate your coming on. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Tucker Carlson, today's name of the show. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday here on Fox Nation. We'll see you every weeknight, 8 p.m. on the Fox News Channel.